My husband, Mark, looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I didn't sign the deed to my mother's historic estate over to a private investor, by midnight, the bank would seize everything and put us on the street. He threw the bankruptcy papers on the kitchen table, his face a mask of devoted concern as he whispered that he had tried everything to save us from my mother's secret debts. I was a wreck, sobbing as I pressed the pen to the paper, feeling like I was betraying my mother's memory just to keep a roof over our heads. But 3 days later, while Mark was celebrating our narrow escape at a business dinner, I found a hidden digital file on his laptop that turned my entire world into a graveyard. It wasn't a bankruptcy filing. It was a purchase agreement for the estate. And the private investor wasn't a company. It was a trust fund. My blood turned to ice when I scrolled to the final page and saw the signature of the beneficiary owner. It wasn't Mark's name. It was mine. Mark hadn't been saving us from debt. He had been gaslighting me into selling my own inheritance to a trust I didn't even know I owned, just so he could gain legal control over the funds. He thought he was playing the long game to steal my fortune, but he forgot one tiny detail. I am the sole trustee of that account, and I just realized I've been my husband's landlord for the last 48 hours. The debt was a lie, the bankruptcy was a fake, and Mark is about to find out that the woman he called clueless just became the most powerful person in his life. Before the story goes any further, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now, to understand how I ended up signing away my mother's legacy in a state of blind panic. You have to understand the slow, methodical erosion of my confidence that Mark had been practicing for 7 years. When I met Mark, I was a high-functioning estate manager for some of the most prestigious properties in the valley. I was sharp, independent, and fiercely protective of the Victorian manor my mother, Eleanor, had spent her life restoring. But Mark didn't want a partner. He wanted an asset he could liquidate. He began a campaign of the soft blur, a psychological tactic where he slowly took over the household finances, under the guise of wanting me to relax and focus on my art. My mother never trusted him. Before she passed away 2 years ago, she pulled me aside and told me that Mark had the eyes of a man who was always measuring the drapes for a sale. She left the estate to me in a complex arrangement, one that Mark spent months trying to decipher. After her funeral, the financial crises began. It started with small things: a rejected credit card here, a late notice from the utility company there. Mark would sigh, rub his temples, and tell me that my mother had left behind a mountain of hidden liabilities and unpaid taxes that were draining our joint accounts. "I'm handling it, Sarah," he would say, his voice dripping with a fake, weary heroism. "But your mother's bookkeeping was a disaster. She was hiding debts from everyone. I'm doing my best to keep us afloat, but I don't know how much longer I can shield you from the truth." He was building a cage out of phantom numbers, and I was too grief-stricken to see the bars. I stopped questioning the expert accountants he hired, men who, I now realize, were just his college friends in expensive suits. The escalation reached a breaking point 3 months ago when Mark came home looking like he'd seen a ghost. He claimed that a private creditor from my mother's past had emerged with a lien against the house. He showed me forged bank statements and frightening legal notices that looked incredibly real to someone who had been systematically disconnected from her own finances. He told me we were $1.2 million in the red and that the only way out was a private sale to an offshore investment group called Aurelius Holdings. "They'll let us stay here as tenants for a year. Sarah," he promised, clutching my hands as if he were my only lifeline. "It buys us time to get back on our feet. If we don't do this, the sheriff will be here by Friday. Do you want to lose everything Eleanor worked for?" He used my love for my mother as a weapon, twisting it until I felt that signing the deed was the only way to save her memory. I felt like a failure, a clueless wife who had let her family's history slip through her fingers, while Mark played the role of the tragic, supportive husband to perfection. The irony was that while Mark was telling me we were broke, he was secretly using my own identity to bypass the inalienable clause in my mother's will. Eleanor had known exactly what kind of man Mark was. She had placed the estate's true wealth into a blind beneficiary trust, a fund that could only be activated if the property was sold or transferred. Mark had spent 2 years trying to get his hands on that money, but he couldn't touch it as long as I owned the house. His plan was brilliant in its cruelty. He would trick me into selling the house to a company he controlled, which would trigger the trust's payout. He assumed that once the money hit the trust, he could use the power of attorney I'd signed over to him during my depressive episode to drain the funds and disappear, leaving me with a leased house and a mountain of actual debt. He treated me like a rough draft of a person, someone too unrefined to understand the high-stakes world of offshore holdings and trust law. But Mark made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the worker bee. He thought that by taking over the bills, he had taken over my brain. He didn't realize that my artistic phase was actually me spending hours in the local archives, slowly piecing together my mother's true financial footprint. By the time he handed me that pen for the Aurelius Holdings contract, I wasn't just signing a deed. I was opening a door he didn't even know existed. He thought he was the architect of my ruin, but he was actually just the first person I was going to evict from my new empire. The silence of the manor at 2 a.m. was usually a comfort, but tonight it felt like the heavy, pressurized air inside a diving bell. Mark was dead to the world in the master suite, dreaming of the millions he thought he'd finally secured, while I sat in the dim light of his home office. I had never been a snooper, but the way he had smirked after the Aurelius Holdings signing, a look of predatory satisfaction he couldn't quite hide, had sent a chill down my spine that no amount of his supportive gaslighting could warm. I had found his laptop unlocked, and what I discovered within 5 minutes didn't just break my heart. It incinerated every memory of our 7-year marriage. The escalation began with a folder buried deep in his system labeled Project Phoenix. Inside were the bankruptcy papers he had forced me to read, except these were the original templates, complete with digital timestamps, showing he had created them himself 3 months prior. There was no private creditor. There were no hidden liabilities left by my mother. Every legal notice, every frightening letter from the bank, and every rejected credit card alert had been a choreographed performance, a digital hallucination manufactured by the man who slept 10 feet away from me. He had been intercepting my mail and rerouting my calls to a VoIP service where his friends played the roles of debt collectors and bank representatives. But the true shock hook was the corporate registry for Aurelius Holdings. Mark had set it up as a shell company in the Cayman Islands, but he had committed a classic error of arrogance. To ensure the inalienable clause in my mother's will was bypassed, the buyer of the estate had to be a legal entity where I held a majority interest. Otherwise, the sale would have been voided by the estate's executors. Mark had listed me as the 51% shareholder of Aurelius without telling me. Intending to use the power of attorney, I'd signed during my grief-stricken state to act on my behalf and drain the accounts the moment the trust payout hit. As I scrolled through his sent emails, I saw the power flip in real time. He had been messaging a woman named Elena, his real partner, telling her that the bird is in the cage and that they would be moving to Switzerland by the end of the month. He called me the perfect Mark and joked about how easy it was to manipulate a woman who loved her dead mother more than her own survival. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to grip the desk to keep from collapsing. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was planning to disappear and leave me to face the legal fallout of a fraudulent offshore sale. I realized then that the Aurelius Holdings contract I had signed wasn't a death warrant for my inheritance, it was a weapon. Because Mark had been so meticulous in making me the legal owner of the shell company to satisfy the will, he had accidentally given me the keys to his entire operation. I wasn't just the 51% owner. Under the blind beneficiary trust rules my mother had set up, the moment the deed was transferred, I became the sole manager of all Aurelius assets, overriding any previous power of attorney. Mark thought he was using my name as a mask, but he had accidentally made me the CEO of his own scam. I didn't scream. I didn't wake him up to confront him with the mirror paradox of his betrayal. Instead, I pulled out my own tablet and logged into the Aurelius corporate portal using the credentials I found in his browser. Within 30 minutes, I had revoked his access to every sub-account. I watched the golden child of the investment world lose his digital empire with a single click. Then I did something even more clinical. I transferred the rent he had been skimming from our joint accounts back into the trust, labeling the transaction unauthorized management fee refund. By 4 a.m., the transformation was complete. Mark was still dreaming of a Swiss villa, but on paper, he was now a man with 0 assets. living in a house owned by a woman who knew exactly what he was. I sat there watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, realizing that the clueless wife he had tried to bury was the one who was about to deliver the eulogy for his career. The stinky country girl of his imagination was dead. The landlord had arrived, and she was ready to collect every cent of the debt he didn't even know he owed. The morning sun hit the breakfast nook with a cruel, golden clarity that Mark seemed to mistake for a victory lap. He walked into the kitchen wearing his favorite cashmere sweater, whistling a tune that made my skin crawl. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the marble island, looking at me with that heroic pity I had once found comforting. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I've been checking the schedules. I think we can start packing the smaller items today. Aurelius Holdings wants to do a walkthrough by Friday, and I want everything to look perfect for our new landlords." I didn't look up from my laptop. I just took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "You're right, Mark. Everything should be perfect," I replied, my voice devoid of the shaky grief he was expecting. "But there's a slight change in the schedule. I've decided to cancel the walkthrough. In fact, I've decided to cancel Aurelius Holdings entirely." Mark's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Sarah, honey, you're stressed. We've been over this. The contract is signed. The debt is real. If we don't follow through, the only legal repercussions we need to worry about, Mark, are the ones involving Project Phoenix," I interrupted, turning the laptop screen toward him. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Mark stared at the screen, which was currently displaying his private email chain with Elena and the digital templates for the bankruptcy notices he had forged. For 5 seconds, the golden child of finance was a statue. Then the mask shattered. He didn't try to apologize. He didn't try to explain. He lunged for the laptop, but I slammed it shut and slid it across the island, well out of his reach. "How did you—" he started, his voice cracking into a jagged, desperate rasp. "How did the clueless wife find the files you left on your unlocked computer while you were dreaming of Switzerland?" I finished for him. "You were so busy measuring the drapes for a sale that you forgot. I was the one who bought the house in the first place. You thought you were using my name to bypass my mother's inalienable clause, but you forgot that by making me the 51% owner of Aurelius, you gave me total executive control. The power flip was absolute." Mark tried to regain his composure, his face twisting into a sneer of frantic arrogance. "So you found the files, so what? You still signed the deed, Sarah. The house is technically owned by Aurelius now. And as your husband and power of attorney, I'll still get—" "You'll get nothing, Mark," I said, pulling a legal document from my bag. "I revoked your power of attorney at 3 a.m., and since I am the majority shareholder and sole manager of Aurelius, I've already authorized the company to sell the property back to me, personally for the sum of $1. The deed is being recorded as we speak." Mark's face went a sickly ash gray. He looked at the kitchen he had tried to steal, realizing that the bird in the cage had just locked the door from the outside. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I have contacts." "You have an appointment," I said, pointing toward the window. In the driveway, 2 black sedans had just pulled up, and 3 men in suits were stepping out. "I spent my artistic morning hours sending your Project Phoenix files to the SEC and the local Tashiar district attorney. It turns out they're very interested in the way you used my mother's estate to mask an offshore money laundering scheme." The mirror paradox was complete. The man who had tried to make me feel small was now the smallest thing in the room. He didn't look like a hero anymore. He looked like a common thief caught with his hands in the vault. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and looked at him one last time. "You were right about one thing, Mark. Someone is getting evicted today." "But it isn't me." Mark didn't wait for the men in suits to reach the front door. The predatory instinct that had allowed him to siphon my life for 7 years kicked into high gear, but it was frantic, unrefined, and fueled by a desperation I had never seen in him before. He scrambled for his keys on the counter, his eyes darting toward the back entrance. "You think you've won because you have the house?" he snarled, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of hatred and panic. "Keep this rotting museum, Sarah. I still have the liquid assets from the first trust payout. Elena and I have a private account in Zurich that you can't touch with 1,000 subpoenas. By the time your men in suits get through the front door, I'll be halfway to the airport, and you'll be left with a beautiful home and a bank account that couldn't buy a loaf of bread." He lunged for the door, but I didn't move to stop him. I didn't need to. I simply opened the Aurelius Holdings dashboard on my tablet one last time and tapped a red icon labeled Emergency Compliance Freeze. Mark, wait, I said, my voice dropping into a clinical, lethal calm. Before you go to the airport, you might want to check your phone. I think Elena is trying to reach you, or at least her lawyers are. Mark stopped at the threshold, his hand on the doorknob. His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his thumb swiping frantically across the screen. I watched the blood drain from his face as he read the notifications. The shock hook wasn't just that he was being investigated. It was that the secret Swiss account, the one he thought was his Project Phoenix lifeboat, didn't exist anymore. What did you do? He whispered, spinning around to face me. That account was encrypted. It was private. How did you... It wasn't private from the majority shareholder of Aurelius Holdings. Mark, I said, standing up and walking toward him. You were so arrogant that you used the Aurelius corporate ID as the primary guarantor for your Swiss transfers to satisfy their, know your customer regulations. Because I am the legal head of Aurelius, I had the authority to report those transfers as fraudulent activity by a rogue employee. The Swiss bank didn't just freeze the money. They've clawed back every cent you sent to Elena over the last 6 months and moved it into the Eleanor Trust escrow account. The legal climax was a total atmospheric collapse for him. He had spent 7 years building a digital fortress, and I had dismantled it in a single night because he had built it on my land with my name. The front door finally opened, and the detectives entered the foyer. Mark looked at them, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked like a rough draft of a man, stripped of the magnetic wealth he had used to mask his emptiness. Ms. Miller, the lead investigator asked, glancing at Mark with visible disdain. We have the files you sent. The SEC has already flagged the Aurelius transactions. Mr. Miller, you are under arrest for grand larceny, identity theft, and multiple counts of financial fraud. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the second time I'd heard that sound in my life, though this time it felt like a symphony, Mark looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He still couldn't believe the clueless wife had been capable of such a forensic execution. I loved you, he lied, one last desperate gasp of gaslighting. No, Mark, I said as the officers began to lead him away. You loved the estate. You loved the trust. You loved the idea of a woman who was too broken to see who you really were. But my mother was right. You were always just measuring the drapes. Too bad you didn't notice I'd already changed the locks. The manor has a different scent now. The heavy, stagnant air of Mark's Project Phoenix Lies has been replaced by the smell of fresh cedar and lemon oil, a scent that reminds me of my mother's hands. 6 months after the Swiss vault collapse, the Victorian estate isn't just a building anymore. It's a living testament to the fact that the truth always finds a way to breathe. The glow isn't coming from the massive legal settlement I won or the fact that Aurelius Holdings has been liquidated to fund a foundation for women recovering from financial abuse. It's the light of a woman who finally knows her own worth. Mark's trial was swift and clinical. When the prosecution played the recordings of his VoIP debt collector calls, the jury didn't even need an hour to reach a verdict. He is currently serving his sentence in a federal facility, stripped of his cashmere sweaters and his magnetic charm. Elena, his real partner, disappeared the moment the Swiss accounts were frozen, proving that the only thing more fragile than Mark's ego was the loyalty of the people he recruited for his scams. I spend my afternoons in the sunroom, the same room where Mark once forced me to sign a bankruptcy paper that didn't exist. I'm no longer the clueless wife hiding in her art. I am the executive who manages the Eleanor, trust with a precision that would make my mother proud. The mirror paradox has been solved. I am both the dreamer and the auditor, the artist and the landlord. Last night, I walked through the foyer and stopped at the mahogany table where the betrayal began. I didn't feel anger or grief. I felt a profound, quiet strength. Mark thought he was the architect of my ruin, but he was actually just the demolition crew. I needed to clear away the old lies so I could build something real. The stinky country girl he imagined is long gone, and in her place stands the owner of the room, the keeper of the legacy, and the only person who holds the keys to this empire.